Um, so before I get started, I am going to say hello. My name is Dr. Suli Inirio, and I am the founder and executive director of the Afro-Latinx Song and Opera Project, a project that focuses on highlighting the contributions of Afro-Latin people in classical music, as well as commissioning new works that tell our stories. The focus is just having agency over our own storytelling and our own narratives and kind of decolonizing the classical music canon, which needs it. Um, I'm super excited to um, have this series called the Afro-Latinidad and series that I'm recording that, we'll have recordings of and also the audio will be a podcast. And I'm very excited for the second talk of the series called Afro-Latinidad and Resistance. I have these wonderful, wonderful people with me here and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So, Dr. Paul Lopez Oro, would you like to start?
Absolutely, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Buiti Rabunyu, buenas tardes. Thank you for having me. My name is Pablo Jose Lopez Oro. I am an assistant professor of Africana Studies and the program director of Africana Studies at Bryn Mawr College. I am joining you all via my home in Brooklyn, New York. My research looks at a transgenerational African indigenous community from Central America's Caribbean coast, the Garinagu, or popularly known as Garifuna. This is a Black indigenous community from Central America's Caribbean coast, specifically Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, that has been transnational. It's been a transnational migrant community in the US since the 1950s, starting in New Orleans. And my specific research looks at that particular community from the 1990s to the present in New York City, with specific ethnographic attention to the South Bronx, Harlem, and Eastern Brooklyn. And I'm really glad to be part of this conversation as both a descendant of Cimarronaje in the Caribbean and throughout the Americas, but also as someone who both politically and intellectually is committed to Black history hemispherically.
Thank you so much, Manuel or Margarita. Who wants to go next?
Go ahead, Manuel.
Oh, yeah, I could go next. Mi nombre es Manuel Mendez. My name is Manuel Mendez. I am Afro Dominicano from the Dominican Republic. I am a local activist here in Washington, D.C., working with the D.C. Afro-Latino Caucus. And also, I am a college grad student at the University of College Park. Not College Park, but University of Maryland College Park. And my research focuses on specifically African information science, Black work, Black cultural work, um, reparative archives, and looking at centering my work centers on Arturo Schomburg and his work in the early 20th century. So um, I am an honor to be a part of this this panel. So thank you so much for being here.
Margarita.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Margarita Rosa, and I am a historian of Caribbean history, African American history, and Brazilian history. So I tend to look at how Black women have rebelled and used cimarronaje, maroonage, as a means of resistance and how we still retain these knowledges today. As some of you know, I also bring this work to social media, highlighting the cultural similarities that we have globally and the ways that resistance has brought us to this shared culture. So it is a true honor to be in this beautiful panel, and I want to hear from folks in the chat. So I love that folks are already using the chat as a means to connect. So we'll definitely be highlighting comments from there and super eager to get started. I am a lecturer in the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College, where I am right now. And I am so pleased to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Inirio.
Thank you all for saying yes. I'm super excited you're here. Two things I want to share just based on the intros. Number one, I call myself a cimarrona all the time. I don't know if y'all know that. Everything I do is cimarronaje for us. Um, so I think cimarronaje in this group is a huge thing and how that looks like today for us and how that that what our ancestors did inspire us to what we do today. And also for this group to know and for people to know. So Afro-Latinx Song and Opera Project is working on an opera commission about Arturo Schomburg currently. It's in the works, so we will see our stories told in different ways. So just be on the lookout for that. Also, opera is a long process, so don't expect it tomorrow. It's gonna take a second. Love y'all. Okay. Let's get started. So I mean, I have some questions, but we're gonna let the conversation go wherever it wants to go. And like Dr. Rosa said, please use the chat. We want to hear from you. This is a conversation. We're not talking at you. We're in community together. So as we get started, resistance is at the heart of the Afro-Latinx experience. How do each of you define resistance in your own work and communities? We kind of touched a little bit on cimarronaje, but let's go a little further. And whoever wants to go can start.
Yeah, so resistance is something that our antepasados and ancestors have used from the very first day to resist European colonization. I was just speaking with my students today about how a group of Taína women or Arawak women on the coast of Samaná stopped Christopher Columbus from docking on that coast in 1492 by throwing flechas. And he noted at the time que tiraban buenas flechas, that they were skilled at throwing these arrows. And so resistance is something that oftentimes Taino people are said to not have had. The general historical narrative that we get is that Taino people were feeble and cowardly and welcomed the Spanish, and they died at their own detriment because they actually did not have the ability to fight back. But what we know from the sources is that Taínos fought back at every single chance they could. The first Spanish settlement, La Navidad, was destroyed by Taínos, namely the tribe of Gaonabo, who was the husband of Anacaona. The second Spanish settlement is also destroyed by the Taínos. And so we see that consistently there is resistance in our lineage. I define resistance as anything that allows us to escape what the capitalist colonialist economy wants us to create, the fantasies of the fantasies that they want us to create for what it means to live a livable life. I believe that resistance is wanting to be part of the land, to eat from the land, to grow the land, and to resist the strains that are put on us by this hyper commercial society. So resistance comes in the everyday. Resistance is eating mango under the shade of a nice tree. That is resistance to me.
Beautifully said.
Feel free to take it away, Manuel. I'm happy to jump in. I'm happy to talk a little bit about how I use the term resistance in my own work, but also to think about, the field of study of Afro-Latinx studies, both as an interdisciplinary field that really challenges both centuries-long anti-Blackness in the region. We deeply, part of what resistance is deeply understanding that Latin American history is Black history, that Caribbean history is Black history, that we would not have this thing called Latin America and the Caribbean without African descended people and Black people, Black culture, Black politics. And I think part of what Afro-Latinidad does, both in the 21st century, all through, right, 1492, is to, in every breath, right, resist colonialism, resist imperialism, resist also certain kind of racializations that make narratives of, pelo malo, of, stay out of the sun, we don't want you to get too dark, right? Like all of that stuff is embedded, in Latinx culture, because there's a certain kind of long history of anti-Blackness in the region that also had the largest African communities in the Americas, right? 10 times more than the global
Mhm.
north, right? And we often forget that Latin America and the Caribbean is a predominantly African descended Black space, right? The Criollos were actually the smaller population, right? So they weren't literally uh, African and indigenous people outnumber Criollos, right? And Criollos, for folks who Latin American History 101, are the descendants of Spanish colonizers born in the Americas, right? That essentially governed, right? So when we think about like the 13 British colonies, there were Thomas Jeffersons all throughout Latin America. We just honor them really differently, right? We don't see them as colonizers, which is part of the Mestizaje project, right? Part of this idea that, we're a racially harmonious society because of the racial mixture, which is very incredibly false, and it denies long centuries of Black resistance in the region and indigenous resistance in the region, right? Indigenous people were not wiped out. They remained very much alive and very much living and breathing in their original homeland, definitely in displacement. So when I think about resistance, I think about this project of wanting to create a world where pelo malo doesn't exist, right? Where, no te dicen, oh, arréglate ese pajón, right? Or this idea of like having to fix Afro-descended phenotypes, right? I still see ads throughout Central America that always, the ads always say persona fina, right? Persona de buena calidad, right? Like all of these very Spanish colonial ideologies around race, right, are still really embedded in our everydays, right? I mean, the idea that mejorando la raza, that's not generationally far away, right? Like that's abuelita lingo, right? That's some of our parents' lingo, right? Mejorando la raza is very much part of a pillar of mestizaje that we work in resistance towards, right? So sorry, just throwing a couple of gems there to talk
No,
about.
that's
Yeah,
great.
absolutely, absolutely. Real quick, and then I'm gonna let Manuel take it on. So broadly speaking, it's resistance is building a world where we could be our full selves unapologetically. And that is more than okay. That is celebrated. That is that is just being, right? We don't have to think about it. We don't have to think about all those little things that you were listing. So yeah, pinning that. Manuel, take it away, bruh.
No, con todo lo que se habló,
No, ¿verdad?
total agreement,
¿Está?
total agreement. Um, yo pensé en a couple of things for me about resistance. I thought about when African people, when Black mothers had babies and deciding to feed them sand because their they didn't want their children to suffer what they were going through. I thought about that as being part of being resistance. I'm not being a tool to their society. I'm not letting them physically beat them to subjectivity. And then I also thought about my own personal, my uncle during the Trujillo era, who people hear a lot of stories about Trujillo and the different ways people were tortured. So my uncle was one of those who got tortured. He kind of like misspoke at a certain time with Trujillo. He was a Navy man, and he was one of those folks that um was against the regime, and he was chopped and thrown to sharks. So, um, I I feel that when we talk about resistance, it's a daily, it's a it's a way of speaking, it's a way of life, it's what you choose to eat, what you choose to look like. Um, what you choose to believe in terms of your deities or the religion that you follow. Who is your Jesus? You know, does your Jesus look like you? Um, so that's a little bit with along with a lot of what the other panelists were talking about.
Resistance as a way of life. Yeah. I always say that, folks know that I'm an opera singer, right? And I'm in a very predominantly white European space, or they want to tell us that Black people weren't part of it. That's a whole lie, right? That's like literally what I do. But just me existing in that space is resistance, right? Just insisting on being my full self in that space is resistance. So, like you said, it's a way of life, it's choices, it's how you move, how you inhabit space, all of those things. So, going further with it, we have a comment on the chat that I think is related that we can kind of go, well, tangent that we want to go to. Fermin says that sometimes what are the strategies for this movement? Sometimes it feels like the topic is great and engaging, but becomes too academic. I just want to say I specifically chose these group of people for this conversation because while they might be academics, they're also very real people in the community. So can y'all speak on that?
100%. Y'all already know accessibility
Exactly.
forte. I'm like, how can I make this as simple as possible? My greatest privilege is when people say to me, you know, my father sent me your content or my mother sent me your content. I'm like, what? We have intergenerational people who are learning online. That is fantastic. And I think that one way that we can make things accessible is to think about how do we meet people where they're at, not where we are and try to get them where we are, but where are they? You know, let's say we're talking about the history of the island of Haiti, Quisqueya, and we want to talk about, let's say, the canals. And we want to talk about, you know, how Haiti is building a canal on the river. Well, I can shout out and say, well, doesn't the Dominican Republic have 18 canals? And isn't your stance anti-Haitian because don't Dominicans already do this? Or I can stop myself, listen to the actual concerns that are being expressed, and find ways to take each of those points, really listen to them, and find actual responses to them that are accurate and historically true. So in that instance, I'm not trying to get people to be where I'm at. I'm trying to meet them where they're at so we can have a discourse. And sometimes we can approach it with questions like, hey, did you know that the first name that the people of the East gave to themselves as an independent nation was La República Independiente del Haití Español, meaning that in 1821, Dominicans considered themselves Haitian. Did you know that the word Quisqueya did not actually come into use after the Haitian Revolution? We see it in one or two or three archival forms, but we see the word Haiti thousands of times. So did you know that Quisqueya does not actually come about until after the Haitian Revolution? Why do you think that is? You know, questions that indicate that you're actually curious about what they think and you're not there to explain. You're not there to pander. You're not there to lecture. So one thing that I'll ask you all, did you know that during the 1500s, the island of Haiti was primarily populated by Black Maroons? That the Spanish settlements were tiny. They look like dots on the map. But the maroon communities, the cimarron communities, the communities who have self-emancipated and self-liberated from the system of reducciones and encomiendas, which is a big word for Spanish settlements, they have escaped these settlements and have fled into the mountains. And in the 1500s, they are the majority. Not only are they the majority on the island of Haiti, But in the same period in Mexico, other than the indigenous people, the most populous group is the Black population, more populous than the white population. The Spaniards were so scared that they were going to lose all their colonies that they tried to abolish slavery several times. Why? Because they said that se huían, se alzaban. And so they're like, our colonial project is failing. So these Spaniards tried to stop slavery because they thought that they were going to lose their islands to the enslaved Africans. That's how powerful maroonage was. So I will ask you as a sister, did you know that during the 1500s, the island was dominated by Black and Indigenous Maroons? Now let's start there with a conversation. So I believe highly in accessibility, and I think asking questions is the primary way to get there, to know where people are at, what they want to see, and instead of telling them a long history, show them documents, show them actual proof, let them feel the pride at seeing that beautiful, gorgeous island being represented in the 1500s on a map, and let them feel the pride of seeing the word ID right above it. And that'll change how they feel.
Yo lo que sé que nosotros, de esta parte de de nuestra lucha, yo soy dominicano, orgullosamente,
Tú no lo tienes que decir.
orgullosamente dominicano, right? Pero lo que yo sé es una cosa que yo no puedo tener una conversación con alguien o tener conversación con personas que quieren eliminar el otro lado de la conversación. So, si
Es-
tenemos una
¿Por qué
conversación
no? Why
abierta,
can't you have a
sí,
conversation with them?
tenemos una conversación abierta. If we have an open conversation that you're going to learn what I'm going to say and I'm going to learn from what you're going to say, it's an equal interaction. But there's some folks in Latin America, there's some folks that resist being open-minded to have conversation that you beautifully explained and asked us to think about these beautiful people that lived in our island, to think about the name Haiti, right? They're not going to, because of the nationalistic aspect of our nations, flag nations, they're not going to think about the dogmatic instilled ideas that some of us have in Latin America. Um, I am in more of a favor to talk to folks who are open-minded and want to learn about these histories and try to get us from these walls, these imaginary but walls that oppress us.
You know what? I'm gonna lovingly and caringly disagree. I think that, and this is our purpose, to talk and to get us to come, in alignment and together. So I politely and lovingly disagree. We have to have those conversations with those individuals, or else we're locking ourselves in a closed room with no one in it. I can promise you that there are hundreds of people who never knew that the original name of the island was Haiti, and maybe with one or two social media posts that last about 30 seconds, they understood. And yes, they did. And not only that, when I have conversations with die-hard Trujillistas and die-hard anti-Haitianos, and I show them the evidence, they at least pause to ponder.
Mhm.
And so I think
Mhm.
it is a duty, it's something I'm faced with all the time. If you look at my comment section, it's just that. It's just that. And if I were to shut out that conversation, I'd be losing a great opportunity. So yes, I do feel more comfortable and more loved and more affirmed in a community like us of people who already know this information.
Right.
And I get you. I understand, and I'm not putting down, like, I feel what you're saying. But I think that it is imperative for us to face those hard conversations, particularly now that we're in a catastrophe on this island that we have to face together.
I just want to say one thing, because you all know I'm a social worker too. Um, a lot of this is social work coded. So I'm just going to say this. The beautiful thing about community is that we all have different roles, right? We all can do different things. We all can lift up in different ways. So if Margarita wants to have those conversations and Manuel doesn't, that's totally fine, right? The reason we're in community is that we could do the work together in different ways because not one of us can do everything.
Y también el enfoque, el enfoque.
Sí.
Nuestra energía no es tratar de convencer a algún fascista de lo que nosotros estamos pensando, de si él es antinegro, si él es anti-haitiano, esa energía que yo le pongo a eso, y no te estoy diciendo que tú estás gastando tu energía, tú estás haciendo un trabajo, I bow down to you, I bow down to that work. But I think like Malcolm X talks about, I think we or John Henry Clark, we need to look in the mirror and work on us. We need to seriously look at the mirror and say, and us, I say those that who are believe that are black and who are believe are Africans and their African loyalty, work on us improving our communities instead of worrying about those kind of people that barely open-minded about anything.
Those are two different approaches, right? Like those are two different ways to do it. There's many paths up the mountain. So I actually
Yeah.
love that this conversation is happening this way. Dr. Lopez Oro, would you like to jump in?
No, I was just going to jump in the conversation. I think it's really important to constantly keep multiple voices in the conversation. There's different, we all have different really deep understandings of our Black history, of Afro-Latinidad. We all come from different, nation state borders, right? We all don't, you know, Honduras's Black history is really different from Haitian and Dominican history, right? Just like in Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico has a completely different experience of Black history, right? Not something that can be compared. And I think sometimes I completely agree. The conversation can be too academic, right? A lot of it can be centered in the ivory tower, absolutely. We also need to be in those spaces, right? Because if we're not in those spaces that Schomburg was curating and fighting for, right, in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, para qué fue, right? We were definitely, we definitely need to be in those spaces. We definitely need to push those academic conversations forward. But there have been also community-based organizations doing the work of resistance within Afro-Latinidad, right, for decades. So something like the Afro-Latino Forum that's been based in Brooklyn, since the early 2000s and has besides public programming around the culture and politics and identities of Afro-Latinidad, it's always been a cultural resource space to learn more about the African diaspora in the Americas, right? And I think knowledge is power, right? Regardless of all of its cliche. I love the work that I see in social media. I love what I see in terms of wanting to uplift unknown histories, right? The fact that Mamatingo could be a household name in 2025 is really important. And that's all due to the social media activism that I see, my fellow Afro-Latinx folks, right? Whether they're Dominican, whether they're Cuban, whether they're Puerto Rican, whatever part of the diaspora they're from, they're doing the work of just sharing knowledge, right? Because part of the resistance is the knowledge, right? So much of how our ancestors get lost in the archive is that we don't have access to that knowledge, right? So like I understand the critique of, it's too academic, right? But all of us have archives, right? All of us have family archives. All of us have oral histories and traditions we carry on, right? So all of that is academic too, right? All of that is really important in academic conversations about Afro-Latinidad and resistance. So I'm excited about this conversation. I'm really grateful for the comments. Keep them coming. Keep them bringing.
You talked about the archives and telling our stories. I think, including myself in this conversation, we all do work that uplifts the stories, right? I think about Manuel, and like my first interaction with Manuel was in talking about collecting the stories of the Afro-Latin community that he was in and uplifting those, right? And I was just so moved by that. Dr. Rosa's work online, telling our stories, digging deep in the archives and telling us those things, right? Dr. Lopez Oro and telling our stories, focusing on Garifuna folks and also at the different intersections of those folks, like, also the LGBTQIA community within our community, right? So tell us about the power of story. How each of you maybe can share a pivotal moment in your own work, in your own career, that you recognize the urgency of the work that you're doing right now.
Well, for me, I took it before this trendiness of Afro-Latinidad. Um, I was searching for um, DMV history, like DC, Maryland, and Virginia history of the Latino community, which is largely Central American based. You know, the black voices, the black Latino voices weren't there. No researchers, no books. Although there has been like books about Latinos in DC in the DMV area, but there was no books, talking about the people that I saw on a regular basis, who were my elders. And so I got offended. So that was the energy that it took. I was like, I'm offended that the fact that scholars are not looking at, these black beautiful people that I'm interacting every day. And so I decided, what would be a winning issue that no one can negate, and that issue was looking at this black Dominican woman. Her name is, who she is 98 years old today, this year. Her name is Casilda Luna, and Casilda Luna was, a public service, a public activist, a social worker who, you know, gave our community the blueprint to navigate the DMV area. Um, she was very present with the civil rights movement, folks who were coming in and out of Washington D.C. Folks like Dr. King and all of the folks that you can imagine. Our elder was in and around. She got involved with the fruit boycott with Cesar Chavez. All the folks that came in and out, but yet no one knew the her name. No one knew her story. No one knew. We knew Casilda, but no one knew who she was. And I was like, we gotta raise her up. And so um, I must say it took a long time, because elders are very protective of their information. And so I just went into our public library and found everything I could about Casilla Luna, all the black folks, I want to say all the black women who work hard to um, make what Latinos in the DMV um, are enjoying to this day. But yes, all in all to say, Casilda Luna is the person that is the blueprint to the activist community, the folks who are in government, the folks who want to rebel, resist. Casilda Luna is that pivotal person for us. And so I use the archives to explain that.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. Pivotal moments in storytelling. That is so beautiful that evidence and stories of individual women can get us there. I totally agree, Manuel. That's such a beautiful way to look at history when we're able to bring that evidence. And Fermin, I know you have to say something. Maybe there's something you can put in the chat for us to look at. That would be lovely. Thank you. I think my moment of realization happened when I was moving uptown and I was searching for homes, and these guys in a corner of the block yell across the street, "Aren't you that girl that talks about history on Instagram? Hey, that's that girl. That's that girl. You see her?" And all these gangster ass guys knew what each other was talking about. They had all watched these videos. And I was like, "What?" And that's what really told me, hey, there's something about the approach that folks are resonating with. There's something about the storytelling that folks are resonating with. And most of the content I do is completely unplanned. It's not like I sit there and I'm like, what's the best way to convince people? I'm just like, okay, if I'm having a conversation with Manuel over coffee, how am I gonna tell him about this? That's the same way that I pick up the camera and I'm like, okay, well, let me just say this in one shot to the camera. And I edit my pauses and silences and all that, but it's usually like a 2-minute endeavor, the whole thing, right? And so for me, storytelling can be very, very beautiful. And Sarina, you said, like, um, are there ways, and I'm not really sure if I understand your question, but are there ways that academic work can be similar to industry systems? I'm not sure if you're saying if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I want academic work to become more palatable, to become like pop culture and music. Why not? When we have these stories, it's incredible to be able to share them. And so I'm not sure that academics have any products to sell. I wish we got made money off our books. We really don't. So we are genuinely committed to our careers and genuinely interested in making this work accessible. So yes, storytelling, using multimedia, being able to inspire the gangsters on the block, like that is what we really want from a democratic academic generation.
Real quick, the accessibility of the work that we do reminds me of bell hooks theory as liberatory practice, right? If anybody has not read that, that's in the look up bell hooks theory as liberatory practice and talks exactly about this. What's the point if our people don't understand it?
Yeah, so the question on storytelling makes me deeply think about the Black women in my family, about the Black women in my neighborhood, in my community, in my trajectory, in my journey, right? In and out of academia. I think storytelling as a method has been incredibly transformative to Black feminists, right? Black queer feminists in particular. I also think storytelling, and I'm trying to think about a couple of multiple moments in my own personal walk, right? About how storytelling um shapes how I even teach, right? About Black history, shapes how I even teach about Black indigenous history. But storytelling becomes a way in which I'm able to narrate, right, my own embodied lived experiences as well as the ones that are in an ancestral archive, right? So thinking about when your archive doesn't have enough raw materials, right, to really turn to, where the written word, right, for a discredited people is no longer valid or there it does not exist. There's this ancestral archive that we all can tap into. And I think storytelling is one of those pathways in which we can tap into, right? And I often think sometimes about even how in ceremony, when you gather with your community, when you gather with your family, and in whatever way you remember your dead, in whatever way you remember your ancestors, right? You pour libations, either you drum, either you bring them into the space through an image, through an object, right? And that can be in any different iteration, right? We don't all have to have the same exact practice, right? But I think storytelling very much as both method, for me, both as method of recovery and embodiment is really important. And it's one that I'm constantly writing about, constantly thinking about, because a lot of it is also um, what was retained orally, right? Like for me, a lot of the bigger questions around the Middle Passage or around the transatlantic slave trade is like what survived, right? And I think oftentimes we can get caught up in the narrative of captivity and bondage. And we can get really stuck in that because that's quite literally the trauma, right, of the archive. The violence of the archive is to constantly reproduce that trauma, reproduce that hatred, that dehumanization, right? But I think oral histories before, especially storytelling, is one that helps us heal from those intergenerational traumas, from those intergenerational wounds, right? In many ways, storytelling, I think there's a lot of community building there, right? That can happen. And I know it sounds very academic, and sometimes it's really hard for me to honestly to like switch lanes, particularly, right? Especially like I teach a wide, right? I teach a wide range of like, you know, high school age students all the way into like, mid 20s, almost grown human beings, right? Like in their 30s. But part of what storytelling for me can remain so compelling is that it's what draws my teaching, right? It's what really grounds my teaching. So when I started class, I'm teaching currently a class at Bryn Mawr entitled hashtag Black Lives Matter Everywhere, theories and ethnographies on the African diasporas. Well, I start with my own African diaspora, right? I share with students an archive of photos of the women in my family, of the Black, Indigenous, Garifuna women in my family that shape, right, that have informed my politics, that have shaped my racial identity, that have deeply given me the language of cimarronaje, right? That to be cimarron was also very much a gendered experience too, right? Like there's a certain kind of gender history with cimarronaje, and particularly Garifuna women have been at the forefront of that, right? So just leaving it there.
There's a lot, this is such a rich conversation. I feel like we could have this conversation for like 4 hours. I might get this group together again. They don't know it yet, but let me, all right, because this is so, so good. Um, as we're talking about storytelling as a vehicle for all these different things, um, I think about uh, barriers, right? I think about um, the intersections, right? Sometimes what I find in my sector is that there's a understanding of whether that's Latinidad or Latinx community or of the Black community that is very homo homogeneous and myopic. And even within that same community, I have to um, let them know that we're beautifully complex and there's so many expressions of Blackness, so many expressions of Afro-Latinidad, so many expressions of this and this and this. And so thinking about that, how do these intersection and these layers and how do we get that across without sounding too academic, right? But also like somebody mentioned, I think it's Fermin mentioned the um, barrier of language, right? We utilize, there's also language, right? There's some people that think that you're not really part of this community if you don't speak Spanish or if you don't, that kind of stuff. So taking that all into consideration, um, how do we get around those challenges and still do the work that we want to do?
I try to think of multimodal learning. Now, that's a big word, and what it means is like, how do we teach with different methods in one simple thing? So that means like if I'm on the board, how am I using visuals, the sound of my voice, and the movement of my hands, all to convey one thing? So let's take it outside the classroom and bring that to social media. How can I use my voice, but also captions, but also images in order to create understanding? So what I have found really cool is to be able to use captions. So I develop content in both Spanish and English, but sometimes it has to do with whatever, I don't really plan out these things. So sometimes it just has to do with whatever language I'm thinking of the thing in. And sometimes I'll translate it, but if I find it really important for a community, I'll do it in that language. But sometimes I get scared of doing things in Spanish that I know are gonna be um so that I don't want to say that I know that are going to be controversial because I know what I'm saying is based in archive, right? So I have no doubt in what I'm saying. But sometimes you don't want your content to become a platform for nationalists. You don't want to platform them. So what ends up
Mhm.
happening is that the way the algorithm works is that if in that those first couple of hours the comment section, hey, if in that first couple of hours the comment section is filled with nationalists, then kind of the way the algorithm works is that it's gonna be consumed by nationalists. And that's a really difficult situation because it's not that I don't want them to talk. I do want them to talk. I actually really want them to talk. But I don't want the comment section to be consumed by that. So there are several times where the way that I organize the content is structured in such a way to invite other people who are not the loudest in the room. Um, and so that way of giving people different entryways into what I'm saying, visual, audio, reading, all in one 30-second video is a way of teaching that we can use to engage accessibly with our communities.
Thinking about
Just
that,
how
when
y'all do it in your classrooms or how y'all do it in your spaces and
yeah,
community.
I would love to know how you do that in community, Manuel, not necessarily in a classroom, but with the community.
Well, here in the DMV, there's the mystique that, I mean, one of the things I wanted to say first is like, and one of the things I got early on in my life was that both English and Spanish are colonizer languages, and that like folks who are really like, I don't know how to speak Spanish, people could like, some people be like, um, you like downgraded your Latinidad because you can't speak a certain way, and when we're in actuality talking a colonized language. So I try to mess with both languages as much as possible, so that the grammar police of both languages frustrate both of them. So, um, but in terms of like engaging with the idea of like how do we translate these things to our family members or to folks who are really interested in this? I try to say I try to use more patient, because again, folks that are going to be open minded about certain things will try to learn the language. We'll try to learn like certain things about our communities and the ways that we look at things, and they're much patient, and I will be much patient with them as too, to learn about different African American aspects of cultures, that some intricacies or some details and nuances that I might not get because my whole household is a Dominican household, you know what I mean, and some African American aspects of things I might not get. I might not know what, certain things are. And so here in the DMV, I have been patient to try to learn as much as I can from folks, and they learn from me as much as possible about Afro-Latinidad, and which literally we're talking about blackness, but because of those barriers of the colonizers, folks from Latin America are as equally black as folks here in the United States. And what we're talking about is blackness and anti-blackness. So,
Yes, 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 yes. Ooh, that's a whole nother talk, right? Woo! Um, I wanted to just say, talking about Manuel, what you said. So, the first time I learned Lift Every Voice and Sing, right, the Black National Anthem was like a couple of years ago, and people were shocked that I didn't know it. And I had to be like, hey, So my culture is Dominican. I grew up listening to Fernandito Villalona and, and things like that. So I had no entryway to knowing this until much later. But again, it's like the diaspora is so complex and vast, and there's so multiple expressions of blackness. Exactly. Like you said, this is just different expressions of blackness that we're talking about. Period.
That's one of the nuances, right? So I learned lift every voice and sing because when I came to when I came to Chocolate City was Chocolate City. So
Right.
you had black music teachers who the first thing they wanted to teach you was lift every voice and sing. And so those were one of the nuances of like I had to learn that song
Right.
in elementary school.
Yeah, I grew up in Miami. So I grew up in a Latin American country. I grew up in north of Havana. So, that's
I love that. I also want to jump in to say
yeah,
that me as a historian of both Afro-Latin American history, but also African American history, it's very different, like cultural even settings, but the history is quite similar. And so it's lovely when we're able, to talk about even the word maroon, which you don't really hear in the United States. You hear more, we hear about palenques, which are maroon communities in Spanish. We hear about quilombos in Portuguese, but we don't hear about maroon communities that much in the US. And I try to talk about how the US system of slavery was isolationist. It purposefully stripped people of their culture. It purposefully put plantations very far away from each other, such that marooning into the mountains was very difficult, and marooning into cities was a bit more common. And so we get less of a conversation about maroon communities. And so when we understand the similarities and the differences, then we're able to have a larger conversation. One way that I always find a way to talk about African American history and Afro-Latin American history is to talk about two systems of slavery. There's the reproductive slavery and there's work onto death slavery. Reproductive slavery means that the enslavers are growing their population by women's wombs, by rape and pillaging and getting them pregnant, right? But work unto death is a model where the enslavers would just work their communities onto death and import new ones. And most colonies fall under one of these categories. Cuba was a work unto death economy. Saint Domingue was a work unto death economy. Santo Domingo was a reproductive slavery economy. United States was a reproductive slavery economy. So in fact, the racial mixing, the the instances of light-skinned Black folk is quite similar in the Dominican Republic and the US. But something about the Spanish language does not allow us to see that similarity. But the Dominican Republic and the United States have so many similarities when it comes to the history of slavery, whereas Cuba and Haiti have a lot of similarities too. So when we start to talk about like the systems that are common or different throughout them, then we can translate these words so that we can realize that we're actually talking about the same thing, just in a different language.
thank you for that beautiful example of how we're similar, right? So, did you want to add to chime in the conversation, Dr. Lopez Oro?
I'm just sitting, I'm marinating, I'm processing it all. I'm really just I'm listening. I'm actively listening.
This was we have so much more that we have in common than we actually think. And I think one of the things that I always run into is that we're purposely not, I think that it's purposeful that these histories are not commonplace for us. Because once we start making those connections, then we start stepping into our power. And once we start stepping into our power, that's when the folks that hold the power get the most, they start freaking out, right? And this happens in the smallest of ways. This happens in the big. We see it happening in the biggest of ways now, but it happens in the smallest of ways too, right? Like I always, people talk about why did I start the Afro-Latinx Song Opera Project? Well, why did I do 10 years of schooling with a whole doctorate and I didn't know that the first person from the New World that was super famous and did the debuts in La Scala, no sé qué, no sé cuánto, was an Afro-Brazilian composer? It's by design. There's Black people in opera from the beginning. From the beginning. And they want to tell us that I don't belong. They want to tell me I don't belong. Right? So all the ways that in which that we are not don't have access to our histories within the narrative is always by design. Um, we're getting close to we about have about half an hour left. I want to ask one more question for us to discuss and then leave it open to Q&A after that. Um, looking ahead, if we look ahead 10, 20 years from now, right? Let's imagine together. What do you hope for Afro-Latin resistance, Afro-Latinx resistance, and the work that we do? And what do you hope that would have achieved? I know this one's a big one.
Bueno, yo espero, yo espero en 20 años. 20 years. I'm imagining that in 20 years, these reoccurring conversations of not knowing who we are or learning who we are is eliminated. Conversations of like too Latino to be black to too black to be Latino and too that conversation I think is super weak, and I hope that we get over that conversation. Um, I hope that or have faith that we'll be in a position to begin to look at more at the continent and learning more about some of the essence that's in the continent that we need in this hemisphere. Um, looking for more networks and organizations that defend our interests in Latin America. Um, hopefully we'll have well, I have faith that we have a whole civil rights black power movement in Latin America that will transform all the constitutions that and that they will acknowledge black people, not just have certain sovereign places where we live and forget about us, but really acknowledge the true histories of our people. Um, I have faith that we'll acknowledge all the sheroes and heroes of all the nations who fought against, white settler, colonial, patriarchal um, folks. So that's a little. I have a lot, but
I'm with you. I'm really with you. Anybody else want to jump in on this question?
It's a really good question. It's a complicated one. It requires us to look to the past. It really requires us to look at our trajectory as someone who was very much around when the field of Afro-Latinx studies was being formed in small little pockets throughout the US. Yeah, I hope the future of Afro Latinx resistance opens up more conversations. But I also know that even the conversation right now about Latine folks in the US Census should be drastically shifted because of Afro-Latinidad and resistance, right? We should not be in a moment where the majority of our um, community members, whether they identify as Black, whether they understand their Blackness, will opt more into non-Black things, right? Will opt into
Yes.
moments of, and I apologize for my four-legged child. Would opt into, right, yeah, yeah. Would opt into more opportunities. I've seen the conversation circle, right? I've seen the multiple circles. I've seen it
Mm-hmm,
around and
mm-hmm,
around and around. Um,
mm-hmm.
none of us should be surprised that there are Spanish speaking Black people in the world, right? None of us should be surprised that Celia Cruz was not the only Black Cuban woman who in her genre, right? Roberto Clemente should be a household name with many other Black Latinx athletes, right?
Right.
But the conversation is cycling, right? And I'm, as one of the co-editors of the second volume for the Afro Latino Reader, we're trying to push the conversation in different directions, in directions that don't reproduce a lot of these kind of,
Right.
unfortunately basic conversations, right? Um, Afro Latinos should still not surprise anyone in any corner of the globe, right? That shouldn't be a
Listen.
surprise. Yet, anytime I fly into Los Angeles or anytime I fly into different parts of the country, right? Oh, usted habla muy bien el español, ¿a dónde lo aprendió? ¿Cómo, cuándo lo aprendió? Right?
Bruh.
That should still not be the question, right?
Right.
I shouldn't have to go to someone's campus and someone looks at my credit card, looks up to me and just like, huh, I would have not guessed you were a Lopez, right? In a quotidian ha 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 way. And I'm just like, the fuck? Yeah, it's like this just literally happened
Yeah.
a few weeks ago, right? Um,
Right.
that shouldn't still be the moment, but that's still the moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's still the moment where I'm explaining to people, yeah, I'm not Dominican, right? I'm definitely, Hondureño, I'm Garifuna, I'm these things, right? But not all
Spicy.
Afro-Latinx people are Dominican, right?
Yes.
Not all Afro, like also not all Afro-Dominicans are anti-Black. Not all Afro,
Thank you.
right?
Woo!
And not all Afro-Dominicans are pro-Black, right? Like there is a long generation, right, of Black Dominicans who have been Black affirming, who deeply understand their
That
Black,
part.
right? And Dominicans still can be the universal scapegoat for anti-Black Latinidad, right? Like that narrative
She's
has to shift.
she's
That
weary. I'm
narrative,
exhausted.
and it isn't exhausting, especially
Yeah.
for Black Dominicans who grow up in affirming. I grew up with the Black Dominicans in Bushwick that knew they were Black and didn't. There wasn't no like. There was
Right.
just no conundrum there. And then I go to Queens for undergrad, and I was like, tú eres indio oscuro. ¿De dónde? Like, and I'm like, wait, what? So then I meet these Dominicans in Jamaica, Queens at St. John's University in the early 2000s who are like, oh, yo no soy negro, yo soy indio oscuro. I'm like, ¿qué? Like, and that's still, like the conversation, I want
Oh
the
man.
conversation to change. And I don't want the conversation to be repetitive. I want us to also have different ways of also engaging. Afro Latinx folks are always in the company of African Americans, right? We don't have any civil rights in this country without African Americans, right? All communities of color are indebted to centuries of political labor of African Americans, right? So part of that is also like the conversation needs to shift, right? Also, what is it about Haitians that are not part of the Afro-Latinx conversation? What is it about the West Indians, right, that should very much be part of this conversation, but they're not, right? So do we want Afro-Latinos in 10 years to still be holding to Spanish colonial borders, right? Do we want us to still adhere to those legacies, or do we want to move the conversation and center Blackness in a way that transcends the nation state, right? Where we don't have these issues of nationalism, where we don't have this fascism taking over our ideologies and thinking, right? Like I'm paying close attention to what's happening in Latin America because there has been centuries of Trumps in Latin America, right? Like Latin
Right.
American people are not new to the kind of president Trump is, right? So I think we need to be very careful and like constantly pay attention to what's happening there because fascism is really, really blowing up in Latin America in really threatening ways where, Black and indigenous communities are the ones who are going to be the most vulnerable to those
Agreed.
regimes.
Agreed. You touched on so many things that touched my soul particularly, so thank you. Especially of like, the all Dominicans being anti-Black. Whew, Lord, I'm always fighting for my life. Anyway, um, Dr. Rosa, where do you want to see us in 20 years?
Girl, I don't know. I
That
I'm
was real.
trying.
She's like, I don't know.
I feel like my perspective is just so different and not
That's
it's
okay.
not always like maybe not the most popular opinion, but what I want to see is massive repatriation. What I want to see is for us to go back, to be able to go back to our people and our land. What I want us to see is to be able to work on our land, to live off our land. And so colonialism has broken us apart by forced migration, by forced economic migration. And what I want to see is a future where we take ownership over our lands, and that is not only economically but also ideologically. And as Dr. Lopez Oro said, shift the conversation to a moment where we're no longer identifying just with nation borders, but rather with our communities and that shared lineage. Sometimes I define the Caribbean not in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of shared labor history, shared colonial history. And that's something that ties someone like me to someone from El Barrio or someone who is white descendant, that history of labor and that history of colonialism. So I want to see massive repatriation, which I'm not sure if it's like a Marcus Garvey argument. I'm not trying to say go back to where you come from, so I don't want that to be the interpretation, but I do highly believe that we need to go back to our lands. If you find yourself not knowing the language of your people, I highly believe it is something that you should look into, learning how to do and getting accustomed to different certain things. I want us to face the uncomfortable realities of our community instead
Mhm.
of trying to build walls around us.
Mm. You know, with other Dominican folks that I know or other folks from, I would say like the Caribbean, Latin America, Caribbean, so like the Cubanos, Puerto Ricanos, and Dominicanos and Haitianos, right? My Haitian friends. We always talk about, and this is like something for me, like my dream of retirement is actually to have my finca in DR. That's what I want. So for you to say that repatriation is what you see in 10 and 20 years, that's what I see for myself, right? That is my dream, to have my finquita con mi burro, con mi chivo, con mi, you know, and be in bliss where I'm from. But to have access to that right now, you know, when so, all these different groups are trying to take, it almost feels impossible, right? So, and I'm not the only one that feels that way. There's so many of us that are like, we just want to go back and have our finquita, have our this, have our that, and just live, like be in the same soil where my people are from. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Fermin brings up an interesting question. Am I referring to the Caribbean or Africa? I am referring to the Caribbean, and I understand that, let's say, when you're talking about African American communities, where are you saying to go back to, right?
Right.
So the message is not go back to anywhere in particular. The message is let's build maroon communities. Let's build communities of self-sustenance. Let's bring for ourselves 40 acres and a mule, right? And that is divorce from the capitalist system. That is, how do you take ownership over your life and your lands, period. And so I'm not saying that it has to be in one particular place. You could do it in Savannah, Georgia. You could do it in South Carolina, which is the blackest port in all the North America. Do it there. Do it in Montana. Do it in San Diego. But how do we create communities that are un affected or unconstrained by capitalism such that we can know our neighbors and share
Right.
sugar with them and even share some mangoes with them. So
Right.
I don't think it's idyllic. I think it's actually very possible. And someone said in the Janet said collective purchasing and land ownership. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Janet.
Yeah,
Perfect. Thank
there's
you.
been such a rise too in like black homesteaders here in the US, right? And it's exactly that, right? Creating something for themselves. There's a bunch of people that have collectively bought, you know, areas where like this is our community, we're gonna be living together. So people are doing it. Yeah. I want to open it up to questions from the folks that are with us today. We have about a little bit over 15 minutes. I know that the chat has been really active, but I want you all to just, any questions? I'm going to start going back a little bit, see if we can touch on some questions that we might have not gotten. Oh, Letitia, yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Letitia.
Hello. Thanks for calling on me.
Yeah.
I'm not in academia anymore, and I'm not even Afro-Latinx. I'm African American, but I very much feel that in order to understand my Blackness, I need to understand the full diaspora. So I just really enjoy being part of this conversation. I am now working within one of the largest childcare organizations here in New York State. And so I wanted to shift gears a little bit and think about our youth. So we serve youth from 5 to all the way to 22. Um, but I'm thinking about the work of Dr. TJ Stewart, focusing on the folks on the margins of the margins. So our youth are not only dealing with trauma, but they're living with very multiple different disabilities, navigating poverty. And what I'm noticing in terms of trauma, not only just coming from their communities and dealing with that generational trauma, but then also dealing with trauma of the staff that we're bringing by putting our youth in these boxes, and me trying to push them to think beyond the scope. And so I'm curious about how do we think about our current climate and what the future is going to hold for us for this particular community, thinking about the intersections of so many other identities. How do we support our children in understanding how to resist? Because they're going to need skills, strategies, and tools to get through the next 4 years and beyond.
That is such a good question. Such a lovely question. And first of all, thank you so much for your statement of how we all have to learn about each other's histories. And I absolutely agree. I just published an article in the Journal of African American History, and am committed to that work. And for me, it's about learning from other communities, learning about Brazilian history, a history that I had no idea about until I was an adult. So I deeply cherish what you stated as the mission that we should all be on. For our children, we have to teach them at home now because we can no longer trust that their history books are going to talk about slavery. We can no longer trust that they're adequately going to learn narratives that we grew up hearing, such as this is a country of immigrants. These narratives are completely changing. So the other day, my little brothers asked me, "Hey, do you support Trump?" And I said, "No." And they were like, "Well, why not?" Because they see people around them supporting Trump all the time. And I had to actually give them logical answers, not just how I felt, but also reasoning behind it. And that was hard because kids can smell bullshit from 5 miles away. So we have to come correct with our knowledge. We have more conviction of our faith and our principles more than ever before. And we have to start doing that work at home. Now, how do we do that as educators? I think in a similar way of having this dynamic where we know what the curriculum says we can't talk about, but we do it anyway. And that's part of the resistance work. So in many ways, taking the role of a parent and being like, okay, we are going to learn about slavery. We are going to learn about the chain gang system. We are going to learn how the chain gang system fed right into the prison system. We are going to learn how every 1 in 10 Black men has been arrested. Like, we are going to learn these things because they know it, they feel it, they see it, but no one has said it. So that's how I feel we should move, but that's so hard to do, Letitia. And that's something that we have to do all the time, and a question that I'm asking myself every day.
Anybody else want to answer? There's a concept recently that I've been exploring, Letitia. It's not new. It's free schools that people put on themselves and teach each other about things that are left out of narratives, that are left out of their curriculums. And I'm actually doing, I'm also a therapist because I'm a social worker. So we're thinking about the concept of a free school at my practice where I work because we do liberation therapy. And so, yeah, getting together with a group of people that want to do the same thing and doing a free school for each other is a way to not only be in community but support each other and also do that work together, because it's not the we have to be in community to do this work. Our ancestors were in community. They didn't do this as individuals. And our current systems tell us that we have to do this as individuals. It's not up to the individual. We got to lean on each other real hard these days. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget that a lot of past generations already have answers to the question you just posed, right? Like the way ethnic studies programs and departments were created in this country, the way African American studies, Black studies was created in this country, it was through student protests, right? It was students shutting down college campuses throughout this country, demanding Black faculty, demanding Black study, demanding history courses, philosophy courses, political science courses that centered not simply the Black experience, but centered Black history, Black politics, Black culture. So I think there's a potential answer there for young people. What I often see, in the world of education, like the K to 12 education, is that you hear the buzzwords, right? Like cultural responsiveness, restorative justice, those things. And I think those are powerful and beautiful, but I also think there is something deep deeply that we have to be aware of the political times we're living. And I don't see this moment being drastically different from the 60s and 70s, when Black and brown students throughout this country shut down campuses in order for them to get the education they want, right? And I think students have to be reminded of that legacy. They don't know about that legacy enough, right? They don't know that it was students, right, that were leading. Faculty were scared. Faculty was scared for their livelihood, right? These were student-centered movement for curriculum change, for department changes, right? And a lot of our high school students, a lot of our K to 12 don't know that history, and they carry it with them. They definitely carry it with them, and they have it in their genealogy, right? So it's in their bloodline to resist. They just need to tap into that historical material.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez Oro. I'm gonna call on Michelle Bancole, who has a question.
Good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful conversation that Dr. Zule has put on. As someone who is a firm believer in maintaining narrative, I'm not of Latin descent, but I am of Indigenous descent as well as Black. My question is in regards to talking about community. I'm curious as how we can foster collaboration within different segments of the community because, for example, I happen to be married to an African from Nigeria, and so I'm very close to that community. How do we how do we make this a collective, a collaborative effort where everybody can benefit and not just it be one sect of us? My family now is currently experiencing the loss of land in Oklahoma, also of being freedmen. So I'm just curious, how do we connect and tie everyone together so that we can build these communities from an educational standpoint, and as far as I currently work at the bank, as far as financial literacy and music, for example.
I love this. I love that you're tying financial literacy into this because that's absolutely right. We need to take ownership back over our communities, not just in a capitalist sense, but also in anti-capitalist senses. I love what's being recommended in the chat about the Herreros and Black Panther and Young Lord style schools. That's fantastic. Um, yeah, the other day I was invited to speak to a group of students, most of whom were Haitian, Guyanese, Jamaican. You had one Dominican in the crowd, and I love that. And they were all learning about the history of the island, of ID. And so I think that more collaboration that we could do, like I would love to attend a lecture by Nigerian folks and Sierra Leone folks and Liberian folks talking about their history. So like the more we could do of marketing outside of our communities, and this is such a perfect example because look at the dynamic community that we have just in the people present in this room. I feel like the more we can market to people outside of our communities, the better we are. And I'm curious to see what other folks have to say too, because I would love some strategies.
Mhm. This is something that we talk about also like through social work, right? So like the idea that we're much more interconnected and we're much more we have many more similarities in the struggles that we're dealing with than we actually think we do, and that being a point of connection and being in community to advocate for ourselves and for our liberation is um, something that we talk about a lot, at least the folks that I'm in community with. And so, yeah, there's folks that are doing this work in different, for example, there's folks that focus on financial literacy, there's folks that focus on this, but bringing all of those organizations and folks that do all the work, that do all that work to come together, that just comes through conversation and being in community too, right? Like, so reaching out, um, doing the work together, having conversations. I should say Michelle is also in Pittsburgh, so we know each other. And so that's something that we can definitely work on together. I'm happy to start doing that work even here.
Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions that anybody else has? Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute or put it in the chat. We have about 5 minutes before we wrap up. If there are no other questions, I actually want to, oh, we have a question. Here we go. Ninfa, I am going to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is my audio okay for you all?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all. My name is Nifa. And I just want to reiterate one more time. Thank you for creating this space. I'm Latina from Honduras, and I'm aware of our, culture in Honduras, love punta. And I know that that comes because of our Black brothers and sisters, the Filipino community and all that they support, in, the culture that we have. But I always need to learn more because I'm me and I come from the background that I come from with parents who are indigenous in an extent, and then parents who are also Spanish and colonizers. And I really appreciated hearing from you all. One question that I had, or just wondering, for the creative scholars on here, is regarding on the advocacy. I know that there is a lot of information sharing and talking about things that we haven't learned, but just on the other hand of a more direct action, and particularly right now under this xenophobic administration that is um, sharing asylum for certain people in South Africa of certain descent, but is stopping any and all protections for individuals from Haiti, from Venezuela, and from other countries currently in the US, right? Just wondering, like, what kind of advocacy you all have done, or what role within the advocacy space do any of you like see your work in? And I would just share that I do advocacy in Maryland here in the DMV, and I really appreciated learning more about, the information that the work that has already been done here in the DMV, and would be very interested in seeing if any of the advocacy work that you all intersect with would be something of in the same line of work that I do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So one of the things about academia and all of its complexities, once the weirdness of getting baptized into this social club we call the PhD, you become an authority, a scholarly expert in a certain kind of capacity because of that experience. So because of the work I do in the Garifuna diaspora, I've had to become a legal expert in a lot of immigration cases, right? So I would have to write an expert letter around talking about the context of anti-Blackness in Honduras, talking about the gang violence and the corruption. But part of the advocacy work is that, at least in my corner of the work, right, is to contextualize to the US government what are some of the conditions of life in Honduras and the rest of Central America for African indigenous communities, right? But also in particular, right, how the nation state in Central America is very violent to Black and indigenous communities, right? Not only around land dispossession, land rights, and land tenure, but also around language, right? Around cultural heritage. I would not be surprised if Honduras makes the drastic shift from being a very mestizo central to a very multicultural, then back to a mestizo centered, where a lot of the work that Black and indigenous communities in Central America have done around language advocacy, cultural advocacy will see a regression. I would not be surprised, right? And that has a lot to do with the political regime of the global north, but also a lot of the fights of the 80s and 90s in the political arena in Latin America from Black and indigenous communities were also deeply shaped by the civil rights movement in the United States, right? So a lot of the Black and indigenous communities in Latin America that fought for land rights and citizenship rights, right, were really building their expertise because there was a global north brother and sisters that had already done it, right? So I think it's important in our advocacy work to always contextualize that history for a lot of people. I know that I have to do that for legal officials, right? Because part of the crisis, right, and even going back to this question about what is Afro-Latinidad and resistance 10, 20 years down the road, is that we also understand that Black people cross the border every single day too, right? That it's
Right.
not simply this idea that we have of who's crossing the US-Mexico border, but that we also deeply understand that there are these Black and indigenous people crossing every single day, and they have a different lived experience as Black, as immigrants, as also sometimes not Spanish speaking, right? Sometimes they're speaking their native language, right? Which could be Creole, could be Garifuna, could be other thing, Mesquite, right? Like we have to deepen our sense of that advocacy, because once they get here, right,
Mm-hmm.
they're dealing with a different terrain, they're dealing with a different experience, right? So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. We're at a time. I know that Aunt, you had one comment. Did you want to share your comment? Oh,
Hello? Yeah.
I know, Aunt. Sorry, can we're let me hold on. I'm gonna
All right, there we go. No, what y'all are doing is amazing. And the comment is straightforward regarding the marketing. I've been on social media, the meta Twitter world for months now. And I'm in the film industry, I'm in marketing and all that. And I was like, yeah, fuck all that. Like, I ain't dealing with that noise. So I found out about you on LinkedIn. And this was a few weeks ago. And now I'm ready to donate money and some resources and time, and I want to get involved, being Afro-Latino, and oh, this nigga speaks Spanish. The fuck, like, pardon me, I know it's recorded. You know what I'm saying? Like, dealing with all that. So I'm just hyped and passionate about what y'all doing on a personal and professional level. So I got a lot of marketing suggestions, but I'll throw that in the email.
Yeah.
Keep doing what y'all doing. Word.
Thank you.
That's
So
it.
I actually am the founder of the thing that put this all together. So if you want to send me an email, I'll be happy to connect, and info@zulianirio.com. But or just you can send me a message via the Afrolatinxopera.org. Okay. Um, and I would love to hear from you. I look forward to it. Or you can send me a message on LinkedIn. Your girl's just book, your girl's busy on the internet. So, wherever you want. So I'm gonna wrap that up because we're over time. I want to say thank you so much to the panelists. Y'all are the best. I am such a big fan of all of you, and I'm such a big man, y'all mean the world to me. So the fact that you said yes was something that I did not believe.
Same. Thank
So
you.
thank y'all so much.
So much. This is
Thank you everybody for coming. Please fill out the post panel survey. The link is in the chat. This helps me serve you better. So thank you so much. If I could ask the panelists to stay for 1 second, everybody else, you can head out. Thank you so much. Love y'all. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye, Macy. Bye. Let me see. Let me stop the recording.